Now, before we add any logic, let's add some styling. For this, attached you find three files. You find the checkout module.css file, which you should use to replace yours with it. You will find a slightly updated modal.module CSS file, which you can use to replace yours. And checkout.js. I also attached this file because there I changed the returned JSX code slightly. For example, I wrapped the buttons in an extra div. So you can either replace your checkout.js file with mine, or at least replace your returned JSX code with mine. And once you did all of that, you should have a form that looks like this. Now, this is scrollable to make sure that we always are able to squeeze everything onto this screen. And of course, as always, you can tweak the styling and change this. This is just some basic styling which does the trick and looks okay, I would say. Now, with that, if we again start from scratch, we can add something to the cart, click on order, and then we get our form here. And actually, this should not be cut off. So I will change height to 19 rem here on the form. Slight oversight from my side, but with that, we're good. Now let's make sure we do get the values the user entered. We then validate them however we want. And we then also either show an error message if something's wrong with the entered data, or we submit it to a server. Now let's start with getting the entered data. For this, we got various options, two main options to be precise. We can either listen to every keystroke, get the entered data and store it in some state and update that state with every keystroke, or we get it once the overall form is submitted. Now in the forms section I showed you both, and I showed you various ways of handling user input and validating it. I showed all of that in great depth there. Therefore here I'll keep it simpler. I will not get the values with every keystroke. Instead I will use a reference with useRef to get the values only once the form is submitted. So I'll import useRef from React, and then we can create a reference by calling useRef, and we'll get a reference for our name input, for example. So a name input reference, which we get by calling useRef, like this. And I'll do this 4 times to repeat it for the street input, for the postal code input, and for the city input. And now we need to connect those refs to the form elements here. And for that, we can use the special ref prop, which we set on the input elements to connect this first input to the name input ref, the second input here to the street input ref, the third input here to the postal code input ref, and the last input here to the city input ref. Now these refs are connected, and now we can use them to read whatever the user entered when the form is submitted. Now for this we got our confirm handler here, and here we can then get the entered name by reaching out to the name input ref .current. It's always .current. That gives you access to the actual value stored in the ref, in this case to the input element. And since we now have access to an input element, we can access .value because every input element object in JavaScript has a value property that holds the actual value entered in that input element. And we also repeat this for the entered street, where we then use the street input ref to get the value, and we repeat it. Whoops, that should be entered street. We also repeat it for the entered postal code to use the postal code input ref. And one last time, we repeat it for the entered city to use the city input ref value. And now we can validate this. Now, it's of course up to you which validation logic you want to apply. I want to keep it fairly simple. I want to check that all my values are not empty and that the postal code, let's say, is exactly 5 digits long. For this, I'll add a couple of helper functions here outside of the component function. And the first one is the isEmpty helper function, where I get a value and return true if value is empty. For that, I call trim on value and then check if the length is equal to 0 or simply if the trimmed string is equal to an empty string. And the second helper function which I'll add here is the isNot5chars, whatever you want to name it, where I get a value and I also trim this and I then check if the length is not equal to 5, so if it's not 5 characters long. Now these two helper functions can be used to now validate those entered values. So we can add a new constant, entered name is valid, and that should be true if we can call isEmpty and pass in the entered name, and that then returns false, so if it's not empty. So entered name is valid if not is empty entered name. If the entered name is not empty, this is valid. And I'll repeat this for the street. So the entered street is valid if not is empty entered street. And I'll repeat that for the city. So the entered city is valid if not is empty entered city. And now for the entered postal code to be valid, I will check if not is not 5 chars for the entered postal code. And that can be a bit confusing to read. Not is not. We could also simply name this is 5 chars up there and check for equality, like this. And then say it's valid if is 5 chars. That's the simpler form of writing this. We could do something similar for isEmpty and check for the opposite, but I think that's not too tricky to understand. Now we got these 4 helper variables here, which hold true or false. And now we can check if the overall form is valid by combining all these values. Only if all 4 constants here have a value of true, the overall form is valid. And I'm doing this very explicitly step by step here to make it as easy to follow along as possible. So now we can check if entered name is valid and entered street is valid. Combine that with entered city is valid. And last but not least, with entered postal code is valid. And only if all 4 together are true, form is valid will be true. So if form is valid, we can now submit the card data, because here we know that we gathered valid data and we cannot proceed with that. But if the form is not valid, we want to show an error. And therefore that's what I'll actually check for here. I'll check if not form is valid, and then I want to set an error and give some feedback to the user regarding what went wrong. For that, I will first of all return here to not continue with code execution, because later I will submit the card data here, and I don't want to reach that code if the form is invalid. But before we make it to this if check, I want to update some state to give the user some feedback. And here I want to manage 4 pieces of state since I have 4 inputs. And therefore, again, we could use useReducer to kind of combine that all, or to manage that with a reducer function in general, but I will stick to useState here. You'll learn about useReducer and all of that in the forms module though. Now we'll use useState, and I will register a new state here with useState. And here, whoops, not like this. Instead, some new state with useState. And here we could use 4 individual state slices or 1 combined state slice. And I'll go for the 1 combined state slice to mix things up. So here I have my form inputs validity and a function to set the form inputs validity. And now that will be an object where I have a name field a street field, a city field, and a postal code field. And now we need to give those fields some values. And I simply want to have true or false as values here, determining whether the field is valid or not. And initially I'll treat them as valid even though they technically aren't, but I don't want to show error messages at the beginning. Now we could work with the touched state in addition to the validity state as we did it in the forms module, but to keep things a bit shorter here, and since we don't have an as elaborate validation approach as we did in the forms module, I will stick to a starting value of true here. Now the goal is to update the correct field for the different inputs here when we submitted the form, to update those true values with the actual validity after we tried to submit the form. So for this, maybe before we even derive form is valid, I will set the form inputs validity state to a new object. And here I want to set the name field to entered name is valid, the street field to entered street is valid, and so on. So I'll use those inferred validities, which we infer here as new values for the different keys in this state object. So here we have the entered postal code is valid value. Now we don't need the function form of this state updating function for updating here, because I am overriding the entire state with a brand new object where I do assign new values to all my keys. And with that we have information about the validity of the different fields. We can now utilize that in the JSX code down there, for example to show an error message. Here for the name, we could check if form inputs validity dot name, so if we dive into the name field, if that is not true, hence the exclamation mark, then we want to show a paragraph where we say please enter a valid name. Now if we do that and save this, you see initially that's empty, but if I try to confirm this, I now get this error. And of course we can now repeat that for all the inputs. So here we check .street and say please enter a valid street. And here we do it for the postal code, so .postal code. And then we say please enter a valid postal code, 5 characters long. And last but not least, here we check for .city and say please enter a valid city. I also prepared some extra styles in the checkout module CSS file where I have an invalid class which we can add to these divs here if an input is invalid to show extra error styles. So here on the name input, for example, instead of just adding the control class, I'll set up a template literal here to always inject the control class into the string, but to also inject another class if that input should be invalid. So here we can check if form inputs validity.name. If that is true, I don't want to add any extra string to that classes string. But if it's false, I want to add classes.invalid here. With that, we add the extra invalid class to that list of classes if that input is not valid. And of course, instead of doing that inline here, we could also grab that code and add a new constant, name control classes, and store that value in that constant so that down there we just point at name control classes like this. That's an alternative way of doing that. And we can now also repeat that for the street by checking for form inputs validity.street. And we do that for the other inputs as well. And we have some code duplication here, but again, that's also something we talked about in the forms module. And we could, for example, reduce that by creating a separate input component, or reduce some other duplication by adding a custom forms hook, for example. For the moment here, I'll stick to this approach. and hence I'll add a postal code control classes constant where I check form inputs validity dot postal code, and then add another constant, the city control classes, where we check form inputs validity dot city. And now we just need to assign these constants to the different divs. So here for the street div, it's the street control classes constant, which we assign as a value for class name. Here for the postal code, it's the postal code control classes, which we assign as a value to class name. And for the city, it's the city control classes. And with those changes made, if we save this, if I confirm this, we get a bunch of error styles. And of course, if I enter something valid and I confirm this, it's not showing up for that input again. So you see that this now works. Now feel free to definitely turn this into a more elaborate form validation here. For example, by adding a custom form hook, or by also listening to the touched state and clearing errors as you start typing. We did dive into all of that in the form section. I just didn't want to bloat this module again with all the topics covered there. Instead, the goal was to pull out the essence of that module and just add some basic form validation here. And therefore, with all of that, we can now also confirm this without errors if we enter valid values. And hence now, as a last step, let's make sure that those values are fetched and are sent to the backend.